At first I thought it was love. Later I realized it was a test. For months I answered without thinking. The call was always from my daughter-in-law, Lydia. And she always asked the same thing before anything else. "Are you alone?" At first I assumed it was kindness. After my son died, Lydia had been raising my grandson on her own, and I knew the evenings could be quiet for both of us. When she asked that question, I thought she was checking on me. But over time, I noticed a pattern I could not ignore. If I told her yes, I was alone. The call ended quickly. Sometimes in less than a minute, she would say goodnight in a calm voice and hang up. If I told her someone was visiting, she asked more questions. Who was there? When they arrived? How long they planned to stay? The change in her tone was small, but I noticed it. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. People worry in different ways, and Lydia had been through enough after losing Daniel. My name is Ursuline May Whitaker. I am 67 years old. I have lived in the same house near Forsyth Park in Savannah for more than 30 years. Since my husband passed away, and then my son last year, the house has been quieter than I ever expected it to be. Last night the call came again at 10:45. Lydia asked her usual question. "Are you alone for the first time since these calls began?" I did not answer honestly. I told her yes. What Lydia did not know was that 2 police officers were sitting in my living room, waiting in silence. About 30 minutes later, someone walked through my yard and tried to open the back door of my house. That was the moment I finally understood the purpose of those nightly calls. But the truth is, the story started much earlier. Not with that door, but with the year my son Daniel died. Daniel died on a rainy afternoon outside Savannah. A truck crossed the center line on the highway, and that was the end of it. The officer who came to the door spoke calmly, but I remember the sound of the rain hitting the porch. More than anything, he said, after the funeral, the house stayed quiet for weeks. Lydia came by often with Mateo, usually in the late afternoon when the house felt quiet. He was 6 then, still small enough to run through the hallway without understanding why everyone spoke more softly. One afternoon, Lydia sat across from me at the kitchen table while Mateo built something with blocks on the floor. She admitted she didn't know how she was going to manage on her own. I told her she and Mateo could always come to my house, and I meant it. She didn't argue, but she didn't look relieved either. She just sat there, staring at the table like she was doing math in her head. One afternoon, she looked more tired than usual. She told me the bills were piling up and that everything cost more than she expected. When I tried to reassure her, she shook her head and said, "You don't see the numbers the way I do." That line stayed with me longer than it should have. Over the next months, she visited regularly. Sometimes she brought groceries. Sometimes she just sat and talked while Mateo watched television. The calls at night started around that time too. One evening, she brought up what Daniel would have wanted for Mateo, and the conversation drifted toward inheritance. I told her plainly, "It will go to him." When she pushed again, I said Mateo was 6 and that nothing would be transferred until he was older. Lydia smiled and acted like she understood, but I noticed she didn't drop the subject as easily as her voice suggested. At the time, I believed we were both protecting the same thing. Looking back, I realized that conversation was the first time Lydia was measuring what stood between her and everything my son left behind. A few weeks after that conversation, I walked into the kitchen one morning and noticed the back door wasn't fully closed. It wasn't wide open, just enough that the latch hadn't caught. I stood there for a moment, looking at it. I'm careful with locks. Living alone teaches you that quickly. Still, I told myself I must have forgotten the night before. The spare key hangs on a hook beside the door. That morning, it looked slightly turned, as if someone had lifted it and set it back. At the time, I assumed I must have touched it myself earlier. Looking back now, I think someone had already tested whether that key would open the door. I picked it up, held it in my hand, then hung it back exactly the way it usually sits. Later that evening, Lydia called, right on time. She asked if I was alone. I said yes. She ended the call quickly, in that calm, practiced way that made it sound like concern. 2 days later, I went into my study to look for a property tax document. The drawer where I keep legal papers was slightly open. Inside, the folders had shifted, not missing, just moved. I stared at them longer than I needed to. That afternoon, my neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, waved to me from her driveway as I checked the mail. "Ursuline," she called out. "Did you have someone over late last night?" "No," I said. "Why, I saw a tall man walking near your yard. Around 11, maybe? I thought he might be visiting." "No one came by." I told her. She shrugged. "Probably someone cutting through the street." I nodded and thanked her, though something about the way she said it stayed with me. That night, the phone rang at 10:45. "Are you alone?" Lydia asked. "Yes." The call ended quickly, just like always. I sat at the kitchen table afterward, thinking about the door, the key, the drawer, and the man Mrs. Alvarez mentioned. None of those things proved anything. Still, something in the house felt slightly different. The way a room feels after someone has walked through it. After Mrs. Alvarez mentioned the man near my yard, I started paying closer attention to the phone calls. The first thing I noticed was the time, 10:45 every night. Not earlier, not later. I began writing it down in a small notebook beside the phone. After a week, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every call came within 1 minute of the same time. That night, when she asked if I was alone, I told her a friend had stopped by. Lydia went quiet, then started pressing for details who it was, when they arrived, how long they'd stay. When I told her I didn't need to report my schedule, her voice tightened, and she said she was only checking because she cared. The call ended soon after, but it didn't feel like care anymore. The next night she called again. "Are you alone?" she asked. "Yes." The call ended in less than 30 seconds. I looked down at the notebook. The times were lined up in a neat column: 10:45, 10:45, 10:46, 10:45, every night for months. I sat there for a long time thinking about the way Lydia reacted when I said someone was visiting. The questions had come too quickly, almost as if she needed the answers right away. That was when a different possibility began to take shape in my mind. Maybe Lydia wasn't calling to check on me. Maybe she was checking whether the house was empty. I didn't like the thought. Lydia was family. She was raising my grandson. But the idea stayed with me long after the phone stopped ringing. A few nights after I started writing down the times, I decided to test something. At 10:45, my phone lit up on the kitchen table. Lydia's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring. The call ended. A minute later, the phone rang again. I watched it vibrate against the wood, but still didn't answer. The third call came about 2 minutes after that. This time, the ringing lasted longer. Then the screen went dark. I sat there for a while, listening to the quiet in the house. Nothing happened. Eventually, I turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. Around midnight, I woke to a sound on the porch. It wasn't loud, just a slow movement across the wooden boards. The kind of sound a person makes when they're trying not to be heard. I stayed still for a moment, listening. Another step. I got out of bed, walked down the hallway, and switched on the porch light near the front door. By the time the light came on, the porch was empty. I opened the door and looked out into the yard. The street was quiet. No cars, no voices, nothing moving. I stood there for a few seconds before closing the door again. The house felt different after that. I went back to the kitchen and looked at the phone sitting on the table. Lydia hadn't called again. I kept thinking about the 3 missed calls and the footsteps that came afterward. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe someone had simply walked past the house at the wrong moment, but the timing was too close to ignore. If Lydia called to find out whether I was alone, and I didn't answer, someone might come by to check. I sat at the table for most of the night, thinking about that possibility. By morning, I could no longer dismiss it. If someone really was watching my house, I needed to know for certain. The next afternoon, I drove to a hardware store on Abercorn Street. I told the clerk I wanted something simple. "Security cameras," I said. He pointed to a small shelf near the counter. "These are easy to set up. Most people install them themselves. I'll take 2. Front and back of the house. That's the idea." He rang them up and slid the box across the counter. "You'll get alerts on your phone when there's movement." "Good," I said. "That's exactly what I need." I spent most of the afternoon figuring out the instructions at my kitchen table. It took longer than I expected, but by evening 1 camera was mounted near the back door and another faced the side gate leading into the yard. I also placed 1 small camera inside the hallway near the study door. If anyone came into the house, I wanted to see where they went. That night, Lydia called at 10:45. "Are you alone?" "Yes." "All right," she said. "I just wanted to check on you." The call ended quickly, the way it usually did. 2 nights passed without anything unusual. On the 3rd night, my phone buzzed while I was sitting in the living room. The camera app showed a motion alert from the backyard. I opened the video. At first, I thought I was looking at the wrong house. Then the porch light reflected off the doorframe, and I recognized it. Lydia stood on the back step. Beside her was a tall man I had never seen before. The 2 of them moved quietly, the way people do when they believe no one is watching. The man checked the windows first, then the door handle. Like someone who had done this before, Lydia then reached for the spare key on the hook beside the door and unlocked it. They stepped inside. I sat there watching the small screen in my hand while the camera switched to the interior view of the hallway. They walked straight into my study. The man opened drawers. Lydia pulled files from the cabinet near my desk. Documents were lifted, examined, then placed back in a slightly different order. Neither of them spoke. They stayed inside for about 10 minutes before leaving the same way they came. I replayed the footage. My hands were shaking the first time, and I had to sit down before watching it again. By the 3rd time, the truth was impossible to ignore. It wasn't a stranger breaking into my house. It was my daughter-in-law. I watched the footage again the next morning with a clearer head. This time, I paid attention to where Lydia was looking. She went straight to the cabinet beside my desk, the one where I keep tax records, insurance papers, and property documents. The man beside her opened drawers while she flipped through folders, not randomly, carefully. They weren't stealing things. They were searching. I paused the video when Lydia pulled out a thick folder marked Estate Documents. She opened it, scanned the pages, then placed it back. That was when I understood what they were trying to find. The will. I leaned back in the chair and let that thought settle. Lydia believed the document was somewhere in the house. What she didn't know was that 6 months earlier, I had moved the official copy into a safe deposit box at a bank downtown. My lawyer had suggested it after Daniel died. Important papers shouldn't sit in a desk drawer, he told me. Too many ways for them to disappear. At the time, I thought he was being cautious. Now I was grateful he insisted. The folders Lydia searched contained copies and older paperwork. Nothing that would give her control of the house or my accounts. Still, the video made something very clear. She was not acting alone. The man with her moved through the room with confidence, like someone who had done this kind of thing before. He opened drawers without hesitation and checked every file carefully. They stayed inside long enough to convince me they believed the document might still be there. I closed the video and sat quietly for a while. For months, Lydia had called every night asking the same question. Now I finally understood why. The next morning, I drove downtown and walked into the Savannah police station with my phone in my hand. I asked the woman at the front desk if someone could look at a video. A few minutes later, an officer named Harris sat across from me in a small office. "What seems to be the problem?" "Ma'am," he asked. I placed the phone on the desk and pressed play. That's my daughter-in-law, I said. He watched quietly as Lydia unlocked the back door and walked into the study with the man beside her. I told him she didn't, and I admitted I didn't recognize the man with her. You believe they're looking for something specific? He said, yes. I told him, my will. If they already entered your home without permission, Harris added, that counts as unlawful entry. If they come back, we can catch them in the act. Another officer stepped into the room and watched the end of the recording. Have they come back since this happened? She asked. Not yet. Harris nodded slowly. If they're searching for documents, they may try again. What happens if they do? I asked. We wait for them. That evening, 2 officers arrived at my house shortly after 10:30. They sat quietly in the living room while the house settled into its usual nighttime silence. At 10:45, my phone lit up. Lydia. I looked at the officers before answering. Harris gave a small nod. I pressed the button. Hello? Are you alone? Lydia asked. For a moment, I didn't answer. I could hear my own breathing and the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then I said it. Yes. The word felt heavier than I expected. It was the first time I had ever lied to Lydia. All right, she said calmly. I just wanted to check on you. The call ended. Neither officer spoke for a few seconds. Harris glanced at the clock on the wall. If your theory is right, he said quietly, someone may be coming soon. About 30 minutes after Lydia's call, the phone on the table vibrated again. This time it was the camera alert. Officer Harris looked at the screen. That's your backyard. Yes. He opened the live video feed. The back gate moved slowly, just enough for someone to slip through. 2 figures entered the yard. Harris nodded toward the door. That's them. Through the small screen, I watched Lydia walk across the yard with the same tall man beside her. They moved carefully, the way people do when they believe the house is empty. Lydia reached the back step first. The man leaned close to the door and spoke quietly. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw Lydia lift the spare key from the hook. She's unlocking it, the second officer said. The key slid into the lock. Before the door opened, Harris stepped forward and pulled it wide from the inside. Savannah Police, he said firmly. Don't move. Lydia froze on the step. The man beside her took half a step back before the second officer grabbed his arm. What are you doing here? Harris asked. Lydia stared at me, standing behind them in the hallway. Ursuline, she said slowly. What is this? You tell me, I replied. The officers separated them on the porch. The man spoke first. I didn't do anything, he said quickly. You entered private property, Harris answered. That's already something. We were just checking on her, Lydia said. Checking on her with a key you didn't have permission to use, the officer replied. The man sighed and lowered his head. It was her idea, he muttered. Lydia turned sharply toward him. Don't say anything. Her voice was low but sharp, but he kept talking. She owes money, he said. More than she can pay. We needed the will. How much? Harris asked. The man hesitated. More than $80,000, he said quietly. Harris crossed his arms. Explain. The house is worth over $200,000, the man said. If we found the will and confirmed control, we could sell it fast and leave. Leave where? Harris asked. Anywhere but here. Lydia didn't say another word. For a moment, she looked at me the same way she had the day of Daniel's funeral. Then she looked away. I stood there listening while the officers placed both of them in handcuffs. The porch light made everything look strangely ordinary, like any other quiet night in the neighborhood, except nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. Lydia was taken away that night in the back of a patrol car. The man who came with her was placed in another vehicle. Neither of them said anything to me as the doors closed. Officer Harris stood beside me on the porch. Do you have family who can help with your grandson? He asked. I do, I said, but Mateo can stay with me. He nodded. We'll make sure the court knows that. A few days later, Mateo came to live in the house full-time. The first night, he walked into the living room and looked around quietly. Mom said we might move away. He told me, Sorte, Grandma, he asked quietly one evening, is Mom coming back? I didn't answer right away. We'll see, I said. For now, you're staying here, okay, he said. Children adjust faster than adults sometimes. The lawyers called a week later about Lydia's situation. One of them asked a question that stayed with me. Did you ever intend to leave anything to Lydia? Yes. I said, I already had. There was a short silence on the phone. Months earlier, I had written a new version of my will. Matteo would receive the house and most of the savings when he became an adult. Lydia was supposed to receive a smaller portion so she could start again if she needed to. She never knew that. Her lawyer eventually requested a copy of the document. But by then, I had already changed it again. One evening, Matteo and I were sitting in the living room when I noticed the clock on the wall, 10:45. For months, that moment meant the phone would light up. That night, it stayed dark. I sat there for a while listening to the quiet house. It felt different now. Not empty, just calm. Trust is a strange thing. You never realize how valuable it is until someone treats it like a shortcut. That's something I learned later than I should have. If you've made it this far in my story, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Share what you think about what happened. Because sometimes other people see things we miss when we're living through them.